17th July 1945, 23:10 Western Pacific, off Hitachi. The deck breathes beneath us, steel rising and falling, while low clouds press so near the masthead disappears and returns. ENS Tom Rains wipes fog from his scope hood and smells salt, warm oil, and the faint sweetness of canvas baked across the Pacific. Battle lanterns stain the plotting room bulkheads red. The 1MC murmurs through static, "Stand by." In turret 2, GM1C red. Pollard tests the breach and watches his men fall into their stations. "Set turret elevation for extreme range," the talker repeats, voice level. Rains leans on the stable element and feeds drift, barometric pressure, and wind into a rangekeeper that hums. The Mk8 radar shows the coast as a thin electric hairline, a seam between dark and darker. Lauren fixes arrive on schedule, pulses stepping across the sea like a metronome. Weather grounded the spotter planes. The night demands arithmetic. Rains learned to love numbers because they kept men alive, and tonight that is the only courtesy the weather will allow. Pollard's world is narrower and hotter. Silk powder bags bloom open like pale flowers. The rammer thumps. The breech swings with the dignity of a bank vault. Check primers. Clear. Load. Men pass powder and projectile through flash doors, movements rehearsed until fear rides the edge of attention, never the centre. The projectiles weigh either 1,900 pounds, high-capacity rounds meant to shatter roofs and light transformer yards, or 2,700-pound armour-piercing slugs that break concrete and bend steel. Everything in the turret exists to keep flame where it belongs. On the bridge, a petty officer says, not loudly, "Where is the Japanese Air Force?" It is half joke, half inventory. No one answers. The question hangs with the breath from our mouths and dissolves into the hiss of rain on warm plating. We know what the enemy expected. They prepared to fight at beaches under Ketsugo, suicide boats, midget subs, the last storm of aircraft. They did not expect a ship to stand off beyond 20 miles and write on their shoreline with mathematics. Rains watches the sweep, the tiny commas of headlands and river mouths returning like a clock. He makes one last check of tide and temperature and the correction for wind shear. He thinks of the men 3 decks down who will turn this clean solution into flame. Pollard runs his thumb over a nick in the breech ring and grins at the powderman, a kid from Toledo who listens for the click that means the breach is truly home. "No hurry," Pollard says. "Just do it right. Match pointers. On. Stand by. Fire." The captain's voice is calm. The order is ordinary enough. In the plotting room, the world narrows to a pencil point where range and bearing meet. We are not special, Rains tells himself. We are part of a system built by a democracy that decided to be exact. The invisible is about to become undeniable. At 23:20, the first salvo leaves turret 2 with a base concussion that kicks ribs and rattles teeth. 3 hearts up the barrel, 1 heartbeat out. The deck shudders. A gust of cordite rolls through the passageway, hot and sweet. Out beyond the bow, rain swallows everything, even the muzzle flash. There is only the tremor coming back through the hull and the thrill of a correct number doing what it promised. The range ladder walks in as if stepping stones had risen from black water. The guns are ready again before anyone has time to think. Pollard's men load and close. The hoists sing, the blowers breathe. Anti-flash hoods frame eyes bright with sweat. A lesson from Maroran runs through Rains's mind. Extreme range for our protection. Haze then, rain now, and still the math carried the day. The coast cannot answer what it cannot see. He knows the figures by heart. The 16-inch 50 rifles can reach roughly 23.5 nautical miles, about 27 statute miles, when elevated to 45 degrees, far beyond the opening range tonight of 23 to 30,000 yards. He will not use every mile, only the ones that keep the ship safe and the targets honest. The deck takes a small, confident crouch as the next sequence begins again. Commands stay clipped. Corrections arrive like measured rain. Somewhere astern, another battleship adds its beat. We cannot see the city and do not need to see it. The instruments see for us, the guns speak for them. This is the moment before everything changes, the second in a long war when eyesight yields to solution, when a free people's arithmetic reaches farther than any doctrine that set out to stop it. The rain becomes privacy, the sea becomes a slide rule, and the ship, faithful and unsentimental, prepares to speak again. Dawn came as a pale smear over Hokkaido, the horizon a rubbed pencil line, and the sea pewter and patient. 2 days before Hitachi, the lesson arrived in another key. Missouri, in company with Iowa and Wisconsin, slid toward Maroran's steel works while a fog-thick haze climbed the stacks and made liars out of eyeballs. The air smelled metallic. Breath looked like smoke. On the bridge, someone said, "No spotters today." Nobody argued. The order of battle would not wait for weather, so the men turned to instruments that did. Rains felt the ship take its firing course and watched the Mk-8 display, a razor of brightness suggesting headlands and harbour mouths. Lauren pulses stepped across the sea in even time. The stable element steadied numbers that otherwise would have danced with the swell. In ideal conditions, a bombardment would use spotting planes to correct fall of shot, but haze pressed them to the deck, so the battery would fire on calculated solutions. The phrase passing through the circuit, extreme range for our protection, meant exactly that. We would keep the shoreline at arm's length. Opening ranges ran between roughly 23 and 30,000 yards, city-killing distances managed by radar plots and Lauren fixes rather than eyes. The men trusted the trace. The trace never blinked. Down in turret 2, Pollard called the cadence. Open, load, close. The projectile car rose, the shell slid on skids and kissed the cradle. Powder. Silk bags came through the flash door one by one, handled gently and treated with suspicion anyway. 7 bags for a full charge on armour piercing, fewer for high capacity at this range. The primer cup went in with a thumb that left a crescent of powder on the skin. He watched cuffs tugged over wrists and hoods set. Anti-flash discipline was law. In weather like this, procedure was mercy. The first salvo walked in ghost steps across an unseen shore. Radar picked up our splashes at the edge of visibility. Reports came back in clipped code, and Rains adjusted range and deflection by the book. Surviving summaries give totals for the whole force, roughly 860 16-inch shells fired by the 3 Iowas at Maroran, numbers that speak louder than any cheer. Exact shell mixes are still argued. What mattered was that shots landed where instruments said they would. If a range gate slid, he caught it and corrected it. If wind veered, he accounted for it. Shore batteries, if any wished to answer, stayed silent or blind. Our doctrine favoured a long reach because a close run-in would offer coastal guns, mines and torpedo craft a better chance than they deserved in 1945. The enemy saved for beaches and daylight. We gave them a riddle from beyond the visible edge. There is a particular quiet that lives inside a battleship when the only eyes that matter glow on consoles. It is not fear, but a kind of concentration that would look like prayer if it were not so practical. One ladder, then another. Walk it right. Walk it short. The plotting room breathed with the ship. Rains could feel corrections tighten like rigging, the way a sailor can tell when a sail finds its wind. Numbers, not enthusiasm, kept the battery honest. If drift changed with weather, he accounted for it. He did not feel like a killer. He felt like a careful man doing careful work, so other careful men would live long enough to go home. A fisherman later would have told Aki Tanaka about that morning, the thunder far seaward, crockery trembling after each distant heartbeat. She would have nodded because she already knew the sound the sea makes when guns speak and fog hides the mouth. Rumour ran ahead of fact. Big ships had arrived, and factories were learning to count in new units. By late morning, the force turned away, the wake stitching grey cloth behind it. On deck, paint wore a lace of ash. Pollard let his men drink water and sit on powder cans in air that felt suddenly lighter without the business of gunnery. Rains wrote strike numbers in a neat hand and bracketed estimates where the record would never be perfect. The point was not a single chimney toppled, but proof that instruments would carry us when eyesight failed. Between the haze at Mororan and the rain at Hitachi lay a straight line drawn by doctrine and confidence. The coastline could be treated as an equation. We would not rush a beach to flatter tradition. We would let reach and reason do the work, and we would come back soon with night as our ally. 2 days later, at 23:20 off Hitachi, Missouri would finish the sentence that began in the fog. Evening settled wet along the Ibaraki coast, the sky a low lid that turned sound into rumour. Lieutenant Saito Harunobu stood over a range board in a dim room whose blackout curtains smelled of mildew and read again the orders that had arrived with too few cartridges. Conserve for the invasion, hold for Kyushu, make every round count at the beaches. He was a competent officer serving a doctrine older than his youth. He sent a runner to confirm telephone lines and returned to his board. The men in his battery checked fuses by touch and memory. Their night optics were clean but limited, their training hours exhausted by the arithmetic of fuel. They had been told the enemy would have to come close, that mines, torpedoes, and courage would even the odds. Saito believed it because belief required no petrol. He traced shore arcs again and measured the reaches he could contest. On a good night against a visible target, his arcs could contest water out to modest distances, but nothing like the reaches rumoured for the newest American battle wagons. Along the road, a bicycle lamp bobbed in the mist. Aki Tanaka pedalled with a shoulder bag of messages between the power station and the machine shop where her father kept tools wrapped in cloth. The lamp was hooded with paper. Every third telephone worked. Whispers travelled faster if they had wheels. She smelled coal dust and seaweed and thought, with the practical mercy of the very young, that she knew which neighbours needed the first space in the trench if the siren ever found its voice. Saito counted fuses again. He had been given maps annotated for a showdown that might never occur, and his ammunition chest felt as ceremonial as a shrine. He remembered his instructor's chalk. Mass fires would break the landing and throw the invader back into the sea. He did not remember much talk of battleships firing from beyond sight in rain while aircraft stayed home. One Missouri broadside of 9 armour-piercing shells weighed roughly 12 tons, more mass in a heartbeat than his garrison could haul by truck in a morning. He did not put it that way on paper. He wrote that enemy battleships possessed great range and that observation was difficult in coastal weather. It was safer to accuse the atmosphere than arithmetic. He dismissed his clerk and walked outside. The alley stones were slick with algae. The roofs made grey steps toward the unseen surf. He stood under a dripping eave and tried, briefly, to summon the clean geometry of tracers on a training range. The clarity would not come. Aki reached the power station as the rain began in earnest. Lanterns swung over panels while men argued about load. She said her father would be at the coke batteries, nods all around. A clerk stamped her slip and handed back a pencil stub. She tucked it behind her ear and pedalled onto the clinic, counting aloud to distract herself from the long quiet between distant thumps that might be thunder and might be something else. Saito sent a messenger to the coastal road with instructions to halt traffic if heavy fire began and to steer civilians toward cover. He told the gun captains to keep men dry and to lay hands on every tool that could matter after a shock. The world had simplified. If the Americans closed, which he judged unlikely, he would spend shells like a miser buying bread. Until then, he would inventory, count, repeat. Across the water, still beyond his best glass, a ship's captain set a fire plan that did not resemble courage because it did not need courage to function. Courage would still be required inside the turrets, but the larger work would be done by instruments that did not tremble. Saito did not fear machines. He feared the arithmetic of a nation that could make them in number and sling them across an ocean. Twilight thickened, and what little horizon there had been folded up. Aki coasted home past shuttered stalls, a loaf of barley bread wrapped in newspaper in her basket, and paused to knot the clinic door with a length of cord she kept for that task. She would have said she was not brave, only useful, and that people needed to know where the flashlight batteries were. The sky heaved once like a sleepy animal and then went quiet again. Far offshore, the Americans completed their checks. The enemy's plan had been tidy, the weather's plan was better. On a timetable measured in seconds and yards, the next chapter was already shaped. At 23:20, Missouri would speak from a distance the coast had not prepared to answer, and the old doctrine would feel the first polite tap of its obituary. Night closed like a lid, and with it came the decision every gunnery officer rehearses, but few truly meet: proceed without spotter planes. Rain blurred sky into sea, and the air tasted faintly of copper. Task Unit 34.8.2 formed on its firing courses, battleships in station, cruisers shouldering lanes, destroyers padding the edges. Somewhere astern, the British battleship King George V kept time to the same grim music. In the plotting room, Rains watched numbers settle into a discipline: range rate, bearing drift, wind, tide. The Mk8's trace returned the coast as a ribbon of light. Lauren pulses stitched fixes at a tempo that comforted men who trusted machines because machines could ignore weather. A radar talker read back bearings, and Rains set his first ladder. One long, one short, one on. Opening ranges ran roughly 23 to 35,000 yards, a city's width of water. The absence of spotting aircraft was not a flourish. Rain and low ceiling had grounded them outright, forcing reliance on radar plots and LORAN timing. Rear Admiral Oscar C. Badger kept the formation true as courses shifted between target sets. Rains listened to bearings from sister ships and folded them into his own solution, a quiet arithmetic of agreement. When fall of shot came back long by a breath, he shaved the range and felt the hull accept the change. Turret 2 breathed like a living thing. Pollard let ritual set the pace. High capacity for transformers, armor-piercing for heavy sheds, silk and steel, powder and projectiles, blowers moving air through a magazine that had learned its lessons the hard way and refused casual habits. The ship's bones amplified each concussion, so it felt as if the hull approved. "No hurry, just speed," Pollard told the powderman, and the kid grinned because he had heard the line before and liked it. "Range correct. Deflection left 20, Rains said, voice steady. He did not pretend he could see the targets, only rain beads on the scope hood and the steady trace that insisted land was where the machine said. A perfect solution acknowledges weather and removes it from the problem. The ship creaked and answered. Salvos stepped inland. The ladder walked like a man crossing stones in a stream. Ashore, the sequence had meaning. Cut power, break rail, crumble coke, silence machine tools, and let the city understand the ocean could unmake industry. Aki felt the shock roll under her feet at the clinic door, a push from the ground that made glass tremble before it broke. She counted to 5, the way a nurse had taught her, and opened the door for a neighbour with a bleeding hand wrapped in cloth. "Stay low," she said, as if that could make safety. Saito's battery listened to the sky and heard freight trains travelling fast. He penciled a range band that ended before the reaches he could hear. No illumination, he told his men. Weather would turn flares into lessons for no one. He considered a few blind ranging shots and put the pencil down. He had been ordered to conserve, and in any case it would be like throwing stones at thunder. The Americans kept time. Missouri's guns settled into a 2 rounds per minute rhythm per rifle, not because of bravado, but because the system supported it. Hoists, blowers, primers, training motors, and the steady hands of men who had drilled until the war's noise felt like the ship's own heartbeat. Rains corrected again, 90 yards short, left 2. A liaison on the circuit, dry as paper, noted the British engaging independently astern. Somewhere a radio operator on a sister ship began a stateside description of the night. Rains caught scraps, calm words from the gun line. War narrowed to tasks. The tasks were being done. He felt the pattern reach a plateau. Numbers stayed in their lanes. Dispersion tightened. Steel and crew agreed on what they were. The Mk8's line held steady. Lauren said yes. The ranges on his board told a story a man who had never seen a coastline could follow. It was no longer bravado to say the guns were writing, each round a sentence, each correction a clause that brought sense out of rain. The rain eased, hardly at all, as if to throw the men a coin for their trouble. Pollard's crew drank water at their posts and wiped powder from their wrists. Rains thought of Maroran's grey lesson and the principle now governing a coast. We would not close to flatter tradition. We would do the work from the edge of the horizon, because the edge had become a tool. The math did not tire. Turret 2 was 3 stories of purpose, pipes and cables like tendons, bulkheads sweating to stay true. Air blew steady through the trunk because panic feeds flame. GM1C Red Pollard kept one glove tucked in his belt and the other on the breech ring, watching grips and shoulders for the slide from respect to fear. Respect kept you alive. Open. Load. Close. The music ran. The projectile car rose. The shell slid on skids and kissed the cradle. Powder. Silk bags came through the flash door one by one, handled gently and treated with suspicion anyway. 7 bags for a full charge on armour-piercing, fewer for high capacity at this range. The primer cup seated with a firm thumb. He watched cuffs tugged over wrists and hoods set. Anti-flash discipline was law. A powder bag snagged on a splinter of wood edging the scuttle. It did not tear, it hesitated. Hesitation is the cousin of fire. Pollard cut the cycle. Hold. He put his palm up as if he could push heat back in time. The bag came free. The men let breath out and said nothing brave. Bravery was doing the next thing next. The breech swung home with the click you learn to trust before you can explain it. Training motors hissed when the turret slewed, elevation drives purred through their arcs, hoists rose and fell with a dignity earned in test after test. Primer igniters rode in their box like coins and were checked twice before a single one touched the breech. Safety interlocks were not suggestions, they were the grammar of survival, preventing a breech from opening angry or a door from admitting flame. Men who treated them as commandments got to argue baseball later. Men who did not were names on bulkheads. Pollard preferred arguments. The gun captain checked the interlock. The pointer announced elevation. The trainer sang with the handwheel. Pollard loved the craft, how a 2 round per minute tempo per rifle came not from swagger, but from a machine fed at the right rate by men who turned repetition into care. He thought of the ammo ship and the quiet men who kept it coming. A scrawny striker from Ohio leaned too far into the scuttle on the next load. Pollard tapped his shoulder, and the boy nodded and altered his angle. "No hurry," Pollard said, not because time didn't matter, but because it mattered enough to treat gently. He pointed his chin at the stencil on the bulkhead. Check fire, flash, door, shut. A turret teaches you to say simple things well. Between salvos, blowers hummed and phones crackled. Heat laid itself across forearms like a sleeping cat. The turret officer called down for a shell change and Pollard relayed it. High capacity for transformers, armour piercing for heavy sheds. Rains upstairs walked the ladder by numbers. Down here steel obeyed. Someone cracked it was a kind of waste to throw so much at darkness. Pollard said, "The only waste is tomorrow's blood." He thought in weights and lives. A 9-gun broadside could weigh more than 12 tons, depending on the mix, but it was the tons you didn't have to spend later that counted. Marines not asked to climb a mined beach, sailors not ordered to anchor under batteries that knew their ranges. He did not put it poetically. He kept the cycle honest, so those later orders would never be written. They talked barrel life between loads because ordinary talk steadies hands. The Mark 7s would be relied on schedule. Effective full-charge counts on a clipboard would decide the when. A gun was measured in wear and attention. The gun captain swore his bore read like scripture. Pollard swore right back and said scripture still needed bookmarks. They smiled without showing teeth. On another ship, the radio voice kept threading sentences home. In Turret 2, the men heard only indoor thunder. Pollard felt the ship's answers come back through the deck and considered the map he could not see. It did not matter. The fire plan climbed a chain that began with men like Rains and ended with men like him. The Republic trusted both ends of the chain. You could feel that trust in the readiness lockers and in the way the magazine crew never asked if it was enough. The snag did not return. The tempo held. The pointer's hands stayed in agreement. Now and then a gale of cordite poured down the passage and men grinned at the smell. It meant the ship was speaking clearly. Pollard checked faces, fatigue, pride, the kind of focus that lets a man get old. The breech whispered shut. Ready. Above them, the sea wrote answers on a coast that had planned for a different examination. Inside the turret, the answer was to keep time. The shell announced itself by pulling air from the room, making floorboards lift as if a tide had passed underneath. Aki Tanaka felt that first pulse in the clinic doorway and steadied an elderly woman with one hand while the other pulled the blackout curtain tighter against the rain. The window glass shivered. A thin crack stopped. Somewhere toward the sea, a bark began, and then thought better of it. Lieutenant Saito heard the same passage as a shape in the air moving faster than sense. His range bands ended before those reaches, and the pencil over his board felt like borrowed authority. No illumination, he said, because a flare would teach nothing except where his men were standing. Hold fire. He hated how the words came easy. He had been taught to meet an enemy where both could see and measure. Tonight, the rules awarded points for not being seen. The city told its own story. Transformer yards coughed blue and tripped breakers older than some of the men who worked them. The power station shed load, recovered, and shed again. Coke batteries hissed, valves rattled. Aki guided neighbours into the trench and counted to 5 between shocks, the trick the nurse had taught her during a daytime drill. A boiler tried to step out of its housing and then thought better of it. The smell was wet coal and hot metal, a tang that lives in the back of the throat. Saito stood the men down from the gun line long enough to check communications. A single phone worked for 10 minutes, then died. He wrote the sentence he dreaded. Observation not possible. He wanted to add that bravery is useless against long-range arithmetic, but he did not. Men in uniform write what is useful upward. Even if he fought his guns to guessed bearings, he would still be throwing stones at thunder. The Americans kept time the way mills keep time. Salvos stepped inland by ordered increments. Reports later would total the force's work around Hitachi at approximately 1,238 16-inch shells in a single night, well over 1,000 tons of steel and explosive thrown by battleships across open water, while aircraft mostly stayed home. A number like that is coal and ore dug and smelted, powder mixed and bagged, ships built and barreled, and men trained to a metronome. Aki thought in smaller units. She noted with relief that the clinic's spare lanterns were where she had hidden them. She fetched water. She pressed a bandage against a cut palm and said, "You're fine," with more certainty than she owned. A man asked, "How far?" She said, "Farther than we can see," and he nodded. The words seemed to settle the room, as if distance itself could act as a brace. Saito walked the parapet and looked out at a coastline he could not see. The rain moved in sheets, the horizon was an idea. He thought of maps that promised a decisive battle at the beach. He had repeated those maps to his men because a teacher had repeated them to him. Out beyond the surf, Missouri and her sisters were discovering that night and weather belonged to them if they trusted instruments. He realized the fight he trained for might never be offered. He put his hand on a cold barrel and felt nothing but the chill. His men looked to him for a decision, and he gave them the only one that would not waste lives for spectacle. Stand by. If the Americans closed, which they would not, he would spend shells like a miser buying bread. Until then, he would inventory, check fuses again, count tools, make sure his people knew the fastest way to ground. It was not courage that earns songs, but it kept names attached to bodies. In the trench, Aki shared the last of the bread and moved toward the warehouse door, counting the interval to be sure the worst of the pattern had passed. She would have said she was not brave, only useful, and that people needed to know where the flashlight batteries were. She pushed the door open and saw the street shifted inches sideways where the curb had broken. The land itself had flinched. The last salvos came like punctuation, firm, inevitable. Rain took the flame out of their arrival. Saito wrote 2 words, "Ceasefire, not ours." He stood under the eave and let water run off the brim of his cap. The enemy had not come, and still they had arrived. Off the coast, Missouri trained her guns to safe and turned to new work. Ashore, people exhaled and counted themselves. The night had spoken from 20 miles and more. Morning would have its tally. Morning begins as a thin seam of pewter beneath the rain, a grey edge the sea insists is the horizon. The ship smells of wet paint and spent cordite. Rains stands at the plotting table with a pencil sharpened to a surgeon's point and copies numbers from the night into the ledger that will become the report. Above him, decks run with rinsed ash. Below him, men in the magazine stack silence back into order. Damage assessment to follow, he writes, and feels that odd relief that comes when arithmetic replaces adrenaline. Missouri fired as planned. The task unit fired even more. Across the force, the 16-inch batteries threw well over 1,000 tons of steel and explosive in a few hours. Tonnage a civilian would call absurd until he sees a transformer yard go dark and a rail spur bend like soft wire. Ranges opened at roughly 23 to 35,000 yards. Corrections were made by radar and Lauren alone, because Rain wrote its own orders. Rains enters times, bearings, ladder steps, drift values, and the short marginal notes that keep numbers honest. Pollard inspects turret 2 with the reverence a man gives a workplace that kept him alive. He runs a rag across the breech ring, palms the primer box, and tells the striker from Ohio he did well to keep his elbows out of the scuttle. No one brags. They drink water that tastes faintly of metal and let the blowers push heat out of pockets where it lingers and schemes. "We'll do it again if asked," Pollard says, not as prophecy but as policy. Policy means somebody has your back at sea. On land, the tally begins in chalk. Aki Tanaka follows the clinic matron through rooms where glass lies in pans like new ice. The power station has tripped and recovered and tripped again. The city's breath comes ragged. A supervisor counts outage hours on his fingers while a clerk writes them down as if numbers could make the floor stop swaying. The coke batteries hiss. A rail car sits sprung with its coupler twisted. Aki fetches water and gauze and locates the lanterns she hid behind a case of iodine. Lieutenant Saito walks the parapet with a notebook damp at the edges. "Observation not possible," he wrote in the night. In daylight he can only add the geometry of craters to the confession. The shells came from beyond the reach of his boards, crossing rain and distance to strike transformers, machine sheds and rails as if the shoreline were a slide rule. He inventories his remaining ammunition because inventory is a kind of piety. He orders men to help at the clinic because pride is cheaper than bitterness. Rains spreads a chart and marks the targets again, this time as a series of consequences. Power off means machines stop. Machines stop means labour moves inland. Labour inland means fewer shifts. Fewer shifts means tomorrow's production is a rumour. He is not a moralist, but he permits himself a thought. Better factories break at night than boys on beaches by day. He pencils it nowhere. The report will speak in its own grammar, clean and dry. He adds one practical line the staff will require. Industrial nodes preconditioned ahead of amphibious operations. The phrase has weight, even if the invasion it anticipates might never arrive. The more thorough the bombardments, the less necessary the beaches. The ship is a tool for ending tomorrows before they become orders. Rain fades to mist, bearings become legible again. A radio watch ticks smoothly in the background like a second heart. Pollard sends a working party topside to scrub powder soot from paint and to coil lines in honest bites. He remembers the snagged bag and feels again the instant when a man's hand becomes the difference between routine and accident. He writes the kit list for the next firing day. New gloves, brush heads, a plane to smooth the scuttle's edge. Logistics, for him, is not a word from a staff meeting. It is the habit of leaving a place better prepared than you found it. Aki delivers a note to the power station and counts the seconds between the returning hum and the next stutter. She has learned to hear a grid's courage. She wheels her bicycle past a wall that has become a diagram, spiderweb cracks etched by the night's arithmetic, and thinks, without anger, that math can be cruel and still be honest. When the matron presses soup into her hands, she eats standing up and says thank you because hunger does not care why it was born. By late morning, the rain falls in smaller coins. Missouri alters course, engines steady, wake like stitching on grey cloth. Rains caps his pencil and carries the ledger to the shack. Transmit when cleared, he says. The petty officer nods. There will be replenishment, and after replenishment there will be orders. The night has done its work. The day will decide what to do with the proof it left behind. They meet the ammo ship in a sea the colour of dull pewter, two steel cities easing together until their wakes braid. Lines go across first, then hoses, then pallets of powder and food and mail, all of it moving with the dignity of habit. Rains watches from the bridge wing as cranes whisper and deck crews signal with small certain hands. Connected replenishment looks like a quiet miracle until you know the arithmetic behind it. Then it looks like a factory with tides and a whistle set by Greenwich. Pollard stands on the turret roof in a borrowed life jacket and checks the booms with an eye that counts tension more than inches. Powder will come aboard in silk-wrapped caution, primers in crates, shells in slings that seem too delicate for their weight until you remember who built the slings. He signs for a crate with a stub pencil and tells a boatswain's mate to mark the scuttle edge where a bag once snagged. A plane will make it right before sundown. The ship hums with patient appetite. Below decks, men stack powder in magazines that breathe like careful animals. Barrel life for the Mark 7s lives on a clipboard as effective full charge counts, a ledger that decides when rifled steel meets lathe ashore and returns with fresh pride. The system does not hope, it schedules. That is how a democracy wages war, by planning routine so the unusual can be met with calm hands. Rains notes relining rotations and training motor checks and smiles at the sound of blowers doing exactly what they should. Out beyond this choreography, the enemy counts scarcity. Saito's allotment of ammunition would not fill a turret car, and fuel rations make training a rumour. Aircraft are hoarded for Ketsugo, but gasoline sits at the centre of every idea, and gasoline has moved from the centre to memory. He walks his battery, speaks to men about patience and cover, and wonders how to defend a beach if the fight stays offshore forever. Aki, moved inland to help at a warehouse clinic, learns a new geography of patience. Ration cards stacked in careful piles, rice measured in spoons, cough syrup divided like treasure. She watches the ledger grow for bandages and imagines another ledger somewhere for shells, and thinks, without doctrine, that the sea has longer arms than maps promised. She has become an expert in the inventory of mercy. The impossible, if you are counting with Saito's pencil, is this. A single afternoon alongside can transfer more fuel to the US task group than the Imperial Navy can spare for a whole battle squadron by the summer of 1945. Oilers treat the ocean like a highway. Convoys arrive on time by the clock logistics sets for empires. An American ammunition ship can make thousands of heavy projectiles a matter of paperwork. A late-war rail spur can barely promise coal to one foundry through a week of sirens. Mail comes across and a kid from Ohio reads a letter with his back against the barbette and grins himself younger by a year. Pollard lets him finish before handing over a wrench. Tools first, then the heart, then tools again. That is how you keep steel human. Rains, reading the signal book, writes the next replenishment time in a neat hand and draws a box around it because certainty is a kindness to the men who sleep in shifts. Saito drafts a paragraph he will never send. We are conserving for a battle that becomes less likely each time they arrive without closing. He tears the page out and puts the facts in proper words. Pride is a discipline, not a decoration, he tells himself. If the Americans turn away again without offering a target, he will count what can be counted and keep his men drilled in the things that still answer: cover, first aid, telephone repair, the courage of patience. By dusk, the pallets are gone, the hoses reeled, the wakes separated into clean parallel tongues. Missouri feels heavier and somehow more exact, as if the math has been refreshed too. Rains stands his watch and thinks of the strange simplicity of abundance. If you can plan it, you can do it again. The enemy must ration courage. We can dress it in procedure and feed it until it no longer shakes. Orders will come. When they do, the guns will meet them with the quiet certainty of a well-kept machine. The voice comes through the headphones like weather, a calm front moving across distance. On the 9th of August 1945, as a mixed Allied force returns to Kamaishi, a stateside audience listens live to the cadence of coordinates and the punctuation of salvos described from the gun line. Rains catches only phrases on a relay and smiles at the ordinariness of it, the war speaking to its own citizens in a tone that treats thunder like itinerary. The sea is grey and untroubled, the coast is not. Pollard checks his crew and thinks of a snagged bag because a man remembers near fires as clearly as hits. The turret smells of oil and old sweat and the private pride of competent hands. "We'll keep time," he tells the striker, and the kid nods like a man agreeing with a clock. Outside, another ship's muzzle flash flickers in the rain, then hides. The work will be done whether anyone at home listens or not. The fact that they can listen belongs to the same arithmetic as the shells. Aki has been sent farther inland as a messenger between clinics. She trots past fields flattened by weather and rumour, carrying lists that are really prayers for gauze and quinine and lamp oil. A loud, patient sound rolls in from the east and makes her pause under a gate. She counts to 5, the superstition that steadied her since Hitachi, and moves on because people wait for lists, and lists make waiting feel like work. She thinks thunder has learned to keep a schedule. Saito stands on a hillside and watches the coast as if the rain might part like a curtain and admit the old kind of battle, one with shapes and distances he can judge. The line does not part. This is not cowardice. It is a different grammar of war that rewards instruments and punishes habit. He has heard talk of a broadcast, of Americans describing their gunnery to their own people as if explaining a timetable, and feels something ancient tilt. The sea once limited stories, now it carries them. The bombardment walks its careful paces. Kamishi's factories have been hit before. They are being taught by repetition that recovery is a race a broken grid rarely wins. In the chaos ashore, prisoners of war will die under the same iron that seeks furnaces, a fact the record will not let sorrow forget. Hearing of such losses later, Rains sets his pencil down and spends a minute with nothing to write, because sometimes the right entry is silence. The impossible statistic lives inside the night as plainly as the voice on the radio. Across the summer's campaign, Home Island's naval gunfire casualties will be counted in the low thousands ashore, yet in single nights the task groups throw more than 1,000 tons of steel and explosive across those miles. That nightly mass, by conservative comparisons in the surveys, would have exceeded what certain late-war rail lines could deliver to a single factory in a week, industry erased by arithmetic at range. Pollard's men keep their cycle. Open, load, close. The music is not pretty, but it stays in key. He feels the deck's returning shudder after each broadside and imagines, not proudly, transformer yards dimming like candle ends. He loves his crew and, in a way he does not confess, the machine that lets their discipline matter. A turret forgives nothing and rewards everything. It is an honest judge of character. Aki delivers her bag of lists and a dented pot of barley coffee appears from a shelf like a magic trick. She takes a cup and holds it under her chin for the warmth and thinks of the radio her uncle smashed when orders required it. She imagines sound crossing ocean like light and decides without anger that the world is bigger than the maps she was given. Saito drafts a message he will send when wires live again. It says the enemy has resumed long-range bombardment with radar-directed fire and that counter-battery remains impossible under present conditions. It notes that civilian morale suffers most when the sea speaks at night. He signs it with a hand that does not shake and files it where damp paper curls like leaves. The broadcast winds down with the politeness of a weather report. The ships turn to their next work with the same lack of drama. Rains draws a short line where the coast has been heard if not seen. The guns cool. The sea goes back to looking like a place a man might fish. But the arithmetic stays in the water, learned to the bone now, and it will remain with men who can listen to their own thunder and keep speaking in sentences a nation understands. Maps lie on the wardroom table like polite arguments, range arcs overlapping beach defences drawn for another kind of war. Rains, now helping draft staff notes, pins transparent overlays and watches numbers refuse to agree with doctrine. Distance has beaten proximity. Instruments have beaten eyesight. Rain has been kinder to men who trust math. He begins a memorandum with words that would feel like heresy a decade earlier. We do not need to close if we can compute. He writes that the 16-inch the 50 Mark 7 rifles can reach roughly 23.5 nautical miles, about 27 statute miles, at 45 degrees elevation, and that July's opening ranges commonly sat between 13 and 20 miles offshore. On nights when weather-grounded spotters, Mk8 radar and LORAN fixes produced an all-weather solution that permitted sequential attack on industrial nodes without illumination. Post-war Japanese tallies list Home Island's naval gunfire casualties in the low thousands. The moral and industrial shock, however, is out of scale to that count. Saito, in a small office that smells of mould and wet rope, writes his own after-action report. Observation was impossible. Ranging shots would have been waste. The enemy fired by instruments beyond the reach of his boards and apparently beyond fear of reprisal. He suggests more camouflage for transformers, more dispersal for machine shops, more trenches for civilians. He does not ask for fuel because asking has become a form of theatre. Aki's world narrows to useful things: a rolled bandage, a hot stone wrapped in cloth for a feverish child, the knowledge that walking 3 blocks under walls is smarter than 1 block in the open. She has learned to tie parcels with a knot that can be undone with cold fingers. She does not speak politics. She knows which doors stick in rain and which boards creak when stepped on lightly. Survival has a curriculum. Rains turns to the question staff always asks, "What does this mean tomorrow?" It means fewer landing rehearsals on beaches aligned with old geometry. It means more ammunition ships on exact schedules, more radar maintenance, more training on LORAN fixes and stable element troubleshooting. It means nights that belong to battleships as surely as days came to belong to the big bombers months before. Every success at distance slightly reduces the need to close, mercy as a byproduct of precision. He adds a paragraph the lawyers will appreciate. Exact shell mixes by target remain disputed in multiple logs. Totals consolidated from reliable studies are used here. Precision is a form of respect, not only for the enemy who must live with our description, but for our own men whose work deserves the right numbers even when the fog tries to borrow them. He resists turning prose into trumpet. The facts are loud enough. Saito's report will not travel far. He files it because filing is what people do who believe the world might once again reward competence. He steps onto a parapet and looks at a shoreline that has not moved even as the meaning of water has. He owns a soldier's courage. That is not the question. The question is whether courage has purchase when arithmetic chooses the terms. On a map in another room, arrows for carriers and submarines converge on coasts like weather systems. The Navy's habit of orchestration, air above, steel offshore, and a cordon beneath, has made islands feel like peninsulas attached to American factories by a bridge of tonnage. That bridge has names: oilers, ammo ships, repair tenders, a dry dock that can rise under a hull like a patient whale. Men like Pollard never see it whole. They feel it when pallets arrive on time. Rains ends with a sentence he is not sure will survive editing. Distance is not mercy, but it can be a tutor. Fewer bodies on a beach are lessons learned in rain. He caps his pen and goes topside to breathe air that smells like paint and cold iron hope. If the war has a last chapter, it will be written on a deck he knows well, with a pen someone else holds. The rifles that reached beyond doctrine will stand witness, while arithmetic ends the argument. Tokyo Bay lies as flat as a promise on the 2nd of September 1945, the overcast hanging low enough to teach flags humility. Rains stands starboard and watches umbrellas bob like small planets around a table carried to the quarterdeck. The deck is wholly stoned to an honour's shine. Every line knows its place the way a sailor finds his berth in darkness. Missouri, which spoke at distance for a summer, has been asked to host the sentence that ends the argument. Pollard walks a slow arc under the turrets, hand trailing along armour that feels cool even in the humid morning. He does not touch the breach. Superstition keeps certain gestures private. He nods to the powder scuttles as if greeting old friends and thinks of the kid from Ohio who learned how to keep elbows away from where fire lives. The crew wears fresh dungarees and faces that have not yet understood what peace will ask. The ship answers orders with the same unshowy grace it gave the night. Aki, now in a town that escaped the worst fires, hears surrender as if it were a new shape of weather. The clinic matron stops sweeping, leans against her broom, and closes her eyes the way a person puts something heavy down without making a sound. Aki thinks of the trench and the transformer yard and the smell of damp paper around a bicycle lamp. She does not weep. She listens to the quiet where waiting had been. Lieutenant Saito stands at attention on a parade ground turned into a room without walls. He watches a flag lowered with a courtesy that makes his throat hurt and promises himself to remember competence wherever he finds it. He knows how defeat tastes when it is salted with relief. He tries to file the moment like a report, colour of sky, posture of men, sound of shoes on boards. It will not file. Some things require witness, not paperwork. On the quarterdeck, pens scratch like small machines. Delegations line up like careful thoughts. A roster of names meets a roster of responsibilities, and the lines between men who have not met until this hour become sentences binding nations. A camera will later frame a rifled bore behind them. Someone will label a particular barrel, Gun 386, and that photograph will become shorthand for a summer of arithmetic. The weapon that reached beyond sight now hosts signatures that prefer daylight. Air carries oil and brass polish and a thread of coffee from a mess deck where messmen did not sleep, because sailors should not sign history on an empty stomach. Pollard thinks of flash doors, interlocks, and the 1,000 times a primer cup seated right. Procedures guarded the lives now standing with umbrellas and folders. Discipline preserved men long enough to present them to this hour intact. He glances at the turrets and thinks they look almost shy. Rains imagines lines he will never write, that the distance from Mauroran's haze to this morning is not measured in miles, but in decisions. Choose radar when clouds remove eyes. Choose the replenishment rendezvous when seas get ugly. Choose the exact word in the log, even when it bruises pride. Choose to fire from ranges that frustrate habit and save sons. A democracy fights like this, one careful choice added to another until the sum tilts the world. Aki carries a pot of barley tea to the clinic door and sets it on the step for whoever comes. She listens to the stillness. It has its own weight. She imagines the sea kneeling briefly to a table on a battleship deck far away. She smiles without meaning to and goes back inside because rooms still need sweeping and ledgers still need columns. Peace is not less work. It is different work with better light. Saito dismisses his men and walks to where grass takes over from gravel. He bows once toward nothing in particular and straightens with a spine that hurts like an old oath. He was not wrong to train. He was wronged by a logic he had not been given tools to answer. In defeat, he chooses courtesy, as he always has. That choice is his flag now. On Missouri's deck, the pens stop. Papers fold with the same care a powder crew gives to silk. Umbrellas drift like a shoal. Rains exhales. Pollard looks up at the turrets and feels, for the first time in a long time, that he can sleep with his boots off. The water wrinkles once as if nodding, and the ship takes the quiet breath it has earned. A museum turret is cold to a child's hand even on a summer day, the steel holding winter like a memory while a volunteer explains how a gun speaks. Years later, a man like Rains will stand near a placard and watch a boy count rifling lands with his finger and hear again the rain on the plotting hood off Hitachi. Pollard will send a donation in a plain envelope and write nothing on the memo line. Aki will fold a newspaper over a loaf and think of blackout paper. Saito will attend a ceremony and choose the front row out of respect. The arithmetic does not end with the shot. It lives in the choices a nation keeps making. The 16-inch 50 Mark 7 could reach roughly 27 statute miles under ideal elevation, but range was never the real miracle. The miracle was that thousands of men agreed on a method and performed it in weather at sea at night, fed by ships that arrived when watches said they should. The impossible was not the distance, it was the routine. Americans turned maintenance into theology so courage could be spent only where it mattered. Consider a ledger that looks like a map. In 1943 alone, American shipyards launched more merchant tonnage than Japan managed during the entire war. The highway of oilers and ammo ships that fed Missouri's certainty was laid by numbers like that. A single summer night's expenditure by a battleship group, well over 1,000 tons of steel and explosive, would have outmassed what certain late-war rail lines could deliver to one factory in a week. This is not mockery. It is the sad geometry of scarcity meeting abundance. A free people built clocks and synchronized them. Meek 8 radar pulses, Loran timing, the cadence of open load close turned into factory work conducted under spray and stars. The Republic made a weapon of schedule. It did not make heroes of machines, it made partners of them. A turret does not honor you back. Men honor one another by keeping interlocks honest and powder dry, and by laughing quietly when the bag goes through on the first try after someone planes the scuttle edge. That laugh is the sound of victory becoming habit. The legacy is not only tonnage or reach, but the habit of choosing procedure over theatre. Distance did not make war clean. It taught Rains that precision carries its own mercy, and Pollard that discipline is how you love strangers you will never meet. It taught Aki that ration card numbers could be kindness, and Saito that competence is a flag that does not depend on wind. The sea was the classroom. The certificates are unsigned and permanent. What follows such arithmetic is an obligation. The guns went quiet because the math had done its job. but the arithmetic that built them kept counting into peace. Ships over oceans with food instead of powder. Ledgers that tracked classrooms instead of shells. Schedules that delivered vaccines on time to docks where war once unloaded fire. A nation that can plan a night shoot in rain can also plan a school lunch. That is not sentiment, it is logistics wearing a smile. The child at the turret asks how far the gun could shoot, and a volunteer says almost 27 miles if you let it climb. The child's eyes widen because a mile is already longer than his street, and he has never seen 27 of anything sitting still. The man beside him considers other distances, from Muroran's haze to Tokyo Bay's pen, from a snagged powder bag to a name not carved on bronze, from a warehouse ledger to a flag lowered without spite. The hardest distance is the one between pride and responsibility, and it must be walked every generation. There is a last number worth keeping. It is the count of days between the first long-range strikes of July and the morning in September when pens made quiet thunder aboard Missouri, fewer than 50. In that span, a nation proved again that abundance directed by method can unmake the worst plans men draw. The ocean remembers. So do those who stood on its edges and learned to read its grammar. If you walk the deck where the table stood, you can feel, if you allow it, the tremor of sentences finished well. The rifles point inboard now, and the ship is a museum like a careful parent. When rain comes, it sounds like applause too far off to embarrass anyone. The work is to keep the arithmetic honest in the quiet, to remember that range is not a boast but a responsibility, and to pass the ledger to hands that will know which columns matter when weather closes and decisions wait.